It was early August 2022 when I drove out to that old property in northern Nebraska. My Uncle Danny had owned a farm out there for over 2 decades, but nobody had heard from him in almost 3 weeks. He wasn't the type to keep in close contact anyway, but my dad said that his phone was dead and the neighbors hadn't seen his truck move. That was enough for him to ask me to check in. I was 26 back then and I had time. I just quit a job in Lincoln that had been draining me, and I was looking for something different, even if I didn't know what that meant yet. I packed light, some food, extra clothes, flashlight, battery bank, and made the 4-hour drive out there in my Subaru. The highway cut through dry fields, scattered with windbreak trees, old barns half collapsed from age. The air had that yellow-gray haze from all the dust, and it clung to the windshield like fog. It was hot too, the kind of dry heat that makes your throat feel tight. Uncle Danny's farm sat about 12 miles from the nearest town, a tiny place called Hamilton Creek, just a gas station, diner, church, and a few blocks of houses. The turnoff to the property was easy to miss, just a narrow gravel road between overgrown hedgerows. His driveway was worse, rutted and full of weeds, but I made it down slow and steady. It was nearly sundown when I pulled up. The cabin sat near the edge of a dry field, facing west. It wasn't much. A single-story place with faded white siding, green tin roof, and a wraparound porch that looked like it had been built back when people still used nails by hand. Off to the side was a small barn, and behind that, an old storage shed. There were no animals anymore. I saw a few rusted-out fences and some broken gates, but no livestock, no signs of them either. Just dry fields and grass that hadn't been cut in months. His truck was there, parked crooked behind the barn, door half open. I walked over to it first. The inside was a mess. Tools on the floor, a crumpled grocery receipt on the seat dated July 10th, 3 weeks ago. There were empty bottles in the cup holders and an old thermos, still half full. I tried the keys still in the ignition, but the battery was dead. I stepped up onto the porch and pushed the cabin door open. It was unlocked. Inside smelled stale, like dust and something else, something slightly sour, like spoiled milk or sweat-soaked clothes. It was dim. The curtains were shut and the windows were grimy, barely letting in any of the golden light left in the sky. I hit the light switch out of habit. Nothing. The power was out. I found a flashlight on the shelf by the door and turned it on. The batteries were still good. I swept the light through the main room, small couch, coffee table, bookshelf, and a wood-burning stove. The kitchen was off to the left, mostly clean, but there were a few dishes in the sink and a pot on the stove. The fridge buzzed a little when I opened it, but the light inside was off. I guess there was just enough solar battery left to run the inverter a little, but not much. I walked through the rest of the cabin. His bedroom looked untouched. Bed made tight like he hadn't slept in it. Closet full of his old flannel shirts and coats. The bathroom was clean, too. Toothbrush dry, nothing unusual. The only thing that stood out was his notebook on the dining table. A brown, leather-covered journal. Danny always scribbled in those. Mostly farm expenses and supply lists. I flipped it open. The last few pages had strange entries. Half sentences, dates with nothing beside them, little sketches of fences and corners of the property. On July 14th, he'd just written, "Saw him again near the edge of the corn. Don't think he's from around here." I didn't know what that meant. Maybe some drifter had been hanging around. A thief or someone casing the place. The entry didn't say anything else. I spent the night there. It was a still night, dead quiet except for the occasional creak from the roof cooling off. I laid on the couch with my backpack next to me and the flashlight on the floor beside my hand. I didn't sleep much. The next morning I made a plan. I was going to walk the property, maybe find signs of where Danny had gone. I knew from years ago that he had walking trails out through the fields and back pasture, even one that went down to a dried-out creek bed where he used to shoot bottles off the rocks. The barn was mostly empty. Some rusted tools, empty feed bins, a few bales of hay falling apart. It smelled like oil and old straw. I found one thing strange in there though. His rifle was gone. The gun rack on the wall had 3 empty slots. That wasn't like him. He always kept them stored properly. I also noticed the floor of the barn had fresh drag marks in the dirt, like something heavy had been moved toward the back wall. There were no footprints, just wide scrape marks. I followed them, but they stopped near the rear corner where some wooden crates were stacked. Nothing was hidden behind them. Outside, I circled around the property. The field behind the barn had half-trodden grass that looked like someone had been pacing or walking back and forth over weeks. I followed the path, which curved down toward that dry creek bed I remembered. About 30 minutes into the walk, the hairs on my arms stood up. It was the stillness. No wind, no bugs, not even bird sounds. I scanned the fields. Nothing moved, just a big, quiet emptiness. When I got to the creek bed, I found something that stopped me cold. A little clearing by the dry stream with a metal folding chair in the center. It faced a steep dirt wall, maybe 15 feet tall. In the wall, someone had dug a narrow tunnel, just wide enough for a man to crawl in on his belly. Fresh dirt was piled outside it, like it had been recently dug. No tools nearby, no signs of animals. I crouched beside the opening and felt a cold draft coming out. No smell, no sound. I didn't go in. Instead, I marked it on my phone's GPS and took a photo. I had 1 bar of signal, so I sent it to my dad with a text saying I found something strange. The message didn't send. I turned back toward the cabin. I had that feeling, like something was watching me from the trees, even though I didn't see anyone. I kept my hand near the knife on my belt the whole walk back. When I got to the cabin, I noticed something small had changed. One of the chairs on the porch was moved. I remembered clearly that it had been tucked under the table when I arrived. Now it was pulled out, angled toward the woods. I scanned the trees and fields. Still nothing. That night, I locked the door, bolted the windows, and put a chair under the handle. I tried sleeping again on the couch, but every little creak or rustle from outside made me tense up. Around 1 a.m., I thought I heard the porch creak. Just once. A single heavy step. I stayed completely still and didn't check. I just waited. Nothing followed. When I opened the door the next morning, I found a set of boot prints on the porch. Heavy ones, leading toward the edge of the field. They weren't mine. I had been wearing sneakers. I followed the tracks again, back toward the creek bed. They vanished halfway there, just stopped in the middle of the field. I stood still for a long time, listening. Then I turned back. That afternoon, I went into the shed. It had been padlocked, but I found the key in Danny's kitchen drawer. The inside was crammed with old boxes, scrap metal, rusted parts, and a freezer chest. The freezer was off. I opened it. Inside were dozens of dead birds, mostly crows, all arranged neatly, wrapped in plastic like frozen meat. I shut the lid and backed out. I didn't touch anything else. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up with the flashlight on my lap, staring at the door. Around 3 a.m., I heard something knock. Once. Just one knock on the back wall of the cabin. Not the door, not the porch, the wall. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked to the back window. I didn't turn on any outside lights. I just looked out. Nothing there. But in the morning, I found boot prints behind the cabin again. And in the dirt next to the wall, a long, thin scratch, like someone had dragged a stick or knife along the siding. I packed my things and got ready to leave. But before I left, I walked back to the creek one last time. The tunnel in the dirt wall had collapsed. Just gone. No chair, no pile of dirt. Like it had never been there. But there was something else. A new mound of earth about 10 feet away, smoothed over like a shallow grave. On top of it, Uncle Danny's hat. folded neatly, dusty but not weather-worn, like it had only been placed there recently. I didn't dig. I left that property and never went back. My dad asked me if I found anything, and I told him the truth. I found the place empty, but something had been living out there. Not an animal, not a ghost, just someone. A man maybe, someone Danny had seen. Maybe someone who had been squatting on his land or watching him from the trees. I don't know. The police opened a missing persons report, but nothing came of it. No signs of foul play, no remains found. They chalked it up to a loner who wandered off and maybe got lost in the woods. But I know what I saw. I saw tracks, signs of someone moving at night, watching. I saw how clean that mound of dirt was, how his hat wasn't even wet from the morning dew. Somebody was there, and I think Uncle Danny knew it before anyone else did. I haven't set foot on a farm since. It was late October 2013 when I took some time off and went out to the mountains in eastern Washington. I was 32 then, living alone in Spokane, working as a freelance surveyor. Most of my days were spent either at a drafting table or out on rugged land, hiking through properties and drawing up maps. I didn't have much of a social life, and to be honest, I was okay with that. I liked being alone. People exhausted me, and being out in the woods, even just by myself, felt safer, quieter, more honest. I'd been thinking about taking a few days off and disappearing into the trees for a while. Not for anything big. No phone, no laptop, just some old-fashioned backwoods peace and quiet. I'd found this spot years earlier during a long job for a landowner who'd wanted a full perimeter survey done near Stevens Pass. The area wasn't well-traveled, not even by hikers. No cell service, no trailheads, just miles of forest and ridgelines. That job had taken over a week, and during one of those long days on the north end of his land, I found something unusual. It was an old cabin, not the kind you find on hiking maps or listed on any plat surveys. Just this moss-covered box half swallowed by the trees, sitting a few hundred yards off from a creek. The boards were warped and gray. The windows were broken. Roof looked like it hadn't been touched since before I was born. It didn't have any signs or posted warnings. No trespassing. Nothing. Just sitting there like the woods had forgotten it. I'd made a note of the GPS coordinates back then, out of curiosity, not for work. I didn't go inside at the time. Something about it felt off. Not dangerous, just unsettling. I couldn't really explain why. Maybe it was how quiet it was around there. Like even the birds didn't fly over that patch of trees. Maybe it was just my imagination. Either way, I left it alone. But this time, in 2013, I decided I'd go back. I packed light, a tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, water filter, headlamp, knife, and a little camp stove. I drove out in my old Toyota Tacoma, parked off a maintenance road about 4 miles from the spot, and hiked in. Weather was decent, cold at night but dry, typical for that time of year. I made camp about 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to see it, far enough that I didn't feel like I was in it. My plan wasn't to sleep inside it. I wasn't even sure the floor would hold. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. That first day, I just got my tent set up, gathered some firewood, made dinner, and sat by the fire until it got too cold to stay out. Nothing weird happened, just wind in the trees, leaves skittering across the ground, the occasional rustle of a squirrel or something small in the brush. I slept all right, better than I usually did in the city, honestly. The second day, I decided I'd finally go inside. The front door was hanging off one hinge, half collapsed inward. I pushed it open and had to duck under a thick cobweb hanging from the top corner. The air inside smelled like damp wood, rotting fabric, and old dirt. There were 2 small rooms. One looked like it used to be a kitchen, Old wood stove, some broken shelves, rusted pots. The other room had the remains of a cot, collapsed in on itself. The floorboards were soft in spots, but held my weight. Barely. I walked around slowly, trying to take it all in. It didn't look like anyone had been in here for a long time. Dust covered everything. Dead leaves were scattered across the floor, blown in through broken windows. One wall had something scratched into it. At first I thought it was graffiti, but it wasn't paint. It was carved. A bunch of straight lines and patterns, like someone was keeping tally. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all crowded together in vertical clusters. 10 marks, then a gap, 10 more, over and over. I felt uneasy standing there. Not scared exactly, just like I wasn't supposed to be there. I stepped back outside and walked around the cabin again. On the far side, behind the cabin, there was a small clearing, not more than 20 feet wide. I don't remember seeing that when I first found this place years ago, but now it was clear as day. No underbrush, just packed down dirt, almost like something heavy had been moved in and out over and over again. I walked the edge of the clearing and spotted something sticking out of the ground. A corner of metal. I dug around it with my boot and found a steel hatch, rusted shut. I didn't try to force it. I didn't have any tools with me, and even if I had, something told me to leave it alone. That night was colder. A stiff wind picked up around sunset. I sat in my tent, listening to it push through the trees, creaking the branches overhead. Every so often I'd hear a sharp crack, a limb snapping somewhere out in the dark. Normal stuff, happens all the time out in the woods. But then around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound I couldn't explain. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was footsteps, soft, steady, slow, moving through the brush, not running, not stumbling, just walking. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I lay completely still, holding my breath, listening. They stopped, then nothing. I waited, listening so hard it made my ears ring. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe longer. Eventually, I talked myself out of it. Probably a deer. Could have been an elk. Maybe even a bear. I didn't sleep after that, though. Just waited for the sun to come up. The next morning, I walked the area around my tent, looking for prints or anything out of place. The ground was too dry for good impressions, but I did find one thing that didn't sit right. The cabin door was shut. I knew I'd left it open. It didn't even sit right in the frame anymore. It had been hanging by a single hinge. There's no way wind could have pulled it closed, and it didn't fall back on its own when I went inside. I would have noticed. I walked up slowly, looked around. No signs of anyone. I opened the door again and went inside. Nothing looked touched, but it was hard to be sure. I stood in the center of the main room and listened. Still dead quiet. I backed out, walked around the side again, checked the hatch. Still rusted shut, but something was different. The ground around it looked disturbed, slightly softer, like the dirt had been stirred up. I didn't like that. I packed up most of my gear that afternoon and decided to hike out early the next morning. I didn't feel like spending another night there. I didn't feel safe. That evening, I sat by a small fire until sunset, knife in my lap, just listening. Every sound made me tense. Every snap of a twig made my heart race. But nothing happened. I zipped myself into my tent and tried to sleep. Sometime after midnight, I heard something again. Not footsteps this time. Digging. A scraping, scratching noise, steady and low, coming from behind the cabin. I didn't move. It went on for what felt like an hour. Then it stopped. Then footsteps again. Closer this time. Soft. Careful. I held my knife so tight my hand ached. Then something brushed the side of my tent. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then it was quiet again. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke up with the sun burning through the nylon. I got out of that tent fast, heart still pounding. Nothing was out of place, but I didn't waste time. I stuffed everything into my pack, strapped it shut, and got moving. As I passed the cabin one last time, I saw something that stopped me cold. The hatch was open, not wide, just a few inches, but enough to see the edge of a dark hole beneath it. I didn't go closer. I didn't look inside. I left. Took me 5 hours to hike back to my truck. I didn't stop once. My legs were shaking when I reached the road. I never reported it. What would I say? Some old cabin in the woods had a hatch that opened on its own? No one would care. No one would believe it. And I wasn't sticking around to figure it out. A week later, I looked up the property records for that area out of curiosity. That cabin didn't show up on anything. The parcel wasn't listed as developed. No structures, no utilities, just forest. And that clearing behind the cabin? It wasn't on satellite images from a few years before. I checked archived maps. In 2009, that spot was covered in thick trees. No clearing, no visible cabin even. So either someone had recently cut it out and erased their trail, or it had been hidden for a long time. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they were doing in the ground behind the cabin. And I sure as hell don't want to find out. All I know is this: if you're ever deep in the woods, miles from anything, and you find a cabin that's not on any map, don't go inside. And if you do, don't stick around after dark. After my ex-wife, Melanie, passed away in the fall of 2022, I didn't feel grief in the way people expected. I felt something closer to silence, the kind of silence that follows a loud, chaotic storm. We had been apart for 6 years. The divorce was cold and long, not bitter, just a slow pull apart, but we never fully severed ties. We still shared a mortgage on a small cabin we bought during the better days, deep in the woods of northern Idaho near a town called Spruce Valley. The cabin had been hers in the divorce, but she rarely went there after we split. She got the keys, but I knew she never used them. The place just sat there empty for years. After she passed, her sister contacted me and told me I could do whatever I wanted with it. Sell it, burn it down, live in it. She didn't care. So, after some thinking, I packed up my truck and drove out there in early March 2023. I was 41 at the time, tired, between jobs, a bit heavier than I used to be. I figured the quiet would be good. I'd spend a week at the cabin, clean it up, maybe list it online. It was a solid structure, 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, wraparound porch. Melanie always loved the wraparound porch. She used to sit there in the mornings, feet on the railing, sipping coffee and watching the fog move through the pine trees. The drive took about 6 hours from my apartment in Missoula. I got there in the late afternoon. Snow was still on the ground in patches, but most of it had melted, leaving the earth wet and soft under my boots. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air smelled like thyme, dust, old wood, and something slightly sweet but stale, like forgotten fruit. Inside, the place looked mostly untouched. A few things had been moved around, probably the result of mice or maybe a raccoon that got in. Melanie's books were still on the shelves. Her jacket still hung on the hooks by the door. I ran my hand over one of them, a blue parka she wore the last winter we spent here together. The zipper was rusted. The sleeves had dust lines around the shoulders. I set up my things in the smaller bedroom. I didn't want to sleep in our old room. That felt wrong. I turned on the small generator, got the lights running, and built a fire in the stove. The nights were still cold, dropping down to the 30s. I sat in the old recliner and just listened to the creaks of the place. The wind rubbed against the walls like a whisper. The first night was quiet. I didn't sleep well, but I didn't expect to. The bed was hard, and the place groaned with every gust of wind. Around 2 a.m., I heard what sounded like a thump outside. Just once. I sat up and waited, holding my breath. Then it was silent again. Probably a branch or a chunk of snow falling off the roof. The next day, I went outside to look around. There were deer tracks near the edge of the woods. A few broken branches by the shed. I went in there and found most of our old tools rusted, handles swollen with moisture. I started cleaning. I swept the floors, wiped the counters, opened windows to let in the air. Felt strange, touching everything she had touched. Her toothbrush was still in the bathroom. Her hand cream was on the sink, dried up and crusted around the nozzle. On the second night, I started hearing it again. Not just one thump, several. Soft, slow, rhythmic, like footsteps on the porch. But when I opened the door, nothing was there. The moon was full, shining down through the trees. I walked around the porch with a flashlight. Just the usual shadows. No signs of animals. No tracks. But something about the way the trees stood felt wrong. Like they were watching. I chalked it up to nerves and memories. I was alone, isolated. My mind was probably stirring old ghosts, even though I didn't believe in that kind of thing. The third day, I tried to stay busy. I spent the afternoon clearing out the crawl space beneath the cabin. That's when I found the photo album. It was under a plastic tarp, wrapped in a towel. I didn't remember leaving it there. The last time I saw it was years ago, in our old house before the divorce. It was full of pictures. Me and Melanie, smiling at cookouts, camping trips, the early years. But as I flipped through the pages, I noticed some photos I had never seen before. Pictures of the cabin. Pictures of the woods taken from odd angles, high up like from a tree. Some of them were blurry, but in several you could clearly see the porch. In one photo, Melanie stood by the porch railing, but her face was turned away. I looked closely. The angle was strange, like someone had taken the picture from deep in the woods with a zoom lens. I stared at it for a long time. I couldn't make sense of it. We didn't know anyone out there. We never had neighbors close by. No friends who visited. Just us. Always just us. I brought the album inside and left it on the kitchen table. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay on the mattress, fully clothed, listening. Around midnight, I heard the porch creak again. Steady, slow. One step, then another, then silence. I didn't move. My heart thudded in my chest like it was trying to escape. I waited. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. Just once. A light jiggle. Not aggressive. Almost like someone testing it. Then silence. I waited 30 minutes before I got up and opened the door. The air was freezing. The porch was empty. I stepped out barefoot, flashlight in hand. I scanned the trees. I looked for tracks. Nothing. But I knew I had heard it. I went back in and locked the door. I pushed a chair under the knob. I didn't care how paranoid it looked. On the fourth day, I packed some of my stuff. I wanted to leave, but I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous. I had come here to clean the place, maybe sell it. I could handle one more night. I had to prove to myself that I wasn't falling apart. I spent that afternoon inside, checking every window, every closet, every drawer. I didn't find anything out of place, but something felt off, like the house was holding its breath. That evening, I sat on the porch with a mug of tea. The woods were silent. No birds. No wind. Just stillness. I stayed out there until dark, then went inside and locked up tight. At 2:17 a.m., I woke up to a noise. Not outside. Inside. It was faint but clear. Wood shifting under weight. A slow step. Then another. From the living room. I froze. My body didn't feel like mine. I didn't have a gun. Just a rusted hatchet I found in the shed. I grabbed it and stood in the dark, listening. The footsteps moved slowly toward the kitchen. Then they stopped. I crept toward the door and peeked through the crack. The kitchen was dark, but the photo album on the table was gone. My blood ran cold. I turned on the lights. Nobody. Nothing. All windows shut. Doors locked. But the album was gone. I checked every room, every inch, crawl space, attic. Nothing. I stayed up until the sun rose. When the light finally filled the trees, I got dressed, loaded the truck, and left. I didn't care about cleaning. I didn't care about selling. I just wanted to get out. I stayed at a cheap motel in Sandpoint that night, still shaken. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. No number, just a photo message. It was a picture of me, taken through the cabin window. Me standing in the kitchen, looking at the album. I stared at the screen for an hour. Then I powered the phone off and threw it in the trash. I never went back to the cabin. I had the place listed for sale through a remote agent. Sold it for cheap a few months later to a young couple who wanted something private. I never heard from them. I try not to think about that week, but sometimes, when I'm lying in bed and the wind scrapes the side of my apartment building, I hear it again, that soft, steady creak of footsteps on wood, and I wonder if something ever really left that cabin, or if it was ever really mine to begin with. I don't like telling people where I went that summer. If someone asks, I usually say I was off the grid in Maine, or helping an uncle fix up a place in Montana, or anything else vague that won't lead to more questions. The truth is, I spent 10 days alone at a small cabin near an old graveyard on the outskirts of Harrison, Arkansas. I didn't go there on a dare, and I wasn't chasing some horror fantasy. I went there to get away from my phone, from my job, and from people in general. It was 2016. I was 31, working maintenance at a small hospital in Little Rock. I'd just gone through a breakup and was trying to clear my head. I found the listing for the cabin on an old forum that was mostly used by hunters and backcountry campers. Some guy had posted about this remote spot near Boone County that used to belong to his grandfather. Said it had no running water, no cell service, no neighbors for miles, and no charge, just to email him and ask for directions. I emailed him. He sent back basic driving instructions, a few photos, and a warning that the place was in poor condition. He didn't mention the graveyard. The drive up from Little Rock took nearly 4 hours. I stopped at a gas station in Harrison to fill the tank, load up on canned food, bottled water, and a few packs of cigarettes I didn't plan to smoke unless things got bad. The sun was starting to dip when I pulled off the main road and followed a narrow dirt track for another 30 minutes, winding through woods that looked untouched for years. The last stretch was barely drivable, more like an overgrown trail, and I had to stop twice to clear fallen branches with my hands. The cabin appeared almost suddenly, tucked between a steep hill and a flat clearing covered in brown grass. It was small, maybe 20 feet across, built from rough timber that had turned gray with age. The roof sagged a little on one side, and the windows were dusty and dark. It looked worse than the photos, but I was too tired to care. Behind the cabin, maybe 30 or 40 yards away, was a cluster of old gravestones. I spotted them as I was unloading the car. They were low and moss-covered, tilting at different angles like broken teeth. The graveyard wasn't mentioned in the email, and I stared at it for a long time, wondering why someone would build a home this close to one. But I'd already come this far. I told myself I'd get used to it. Inside, the cabin was a single room with a wood-burning stove, a cot, and a small table. A few rusted tools hung on the wall beside a lantern. I lit the lantern, unpacked, and set up my sleeping bag on the cot. There was no electricity, and the only light came from the oil flame and the moon that rose over the hills behind me. That first night, I kept the door locked and didn't sleep much. Every sound in the woods felt sharp and unnatural. I could hear owls and insects and the occasional snapping of twigs. But it was the silence between the noises that got to me. I grew up in the city and was never used to silence that deep. The next morning, I walked out to the graveyard. I didn't want to, but it was the only thing around, and I figured if I got a good look at it, maybe it would stop bothering me. There were around 15 or 20 headstones, most of them unreadable. A few had names that were still visible. Wilkins, R. 1884 to 1910. Sarah D., wife of J. Turner. Small stones. No signs of upkeep. No flowers or decorations. A few of the graves had caved in slightly, like the ground had settled in on them. I didn't stay long, just walked a slow circle around the edge and went back to the cabin. Still, the image stuck with me all day, those tilted stones and the way they seemed to lean toward the cabin. The days were quiet. I spent time reading old paperbacks I'd brought, chopping wood from a fallen tree behind the cabin, and taking short walks through the woods. I tried to stay busy, but time stretched out up there. An hour felt like 3. The silence started to wear on me. I kept expecting some sound. A plane overhead, a car in the distance, but there was nothing, just trees and wind. On the third night, I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. I didn't know why at first. There was no thunder or animal noise. The lantern had gone out, and the cabin was completely dark. I sat up in the cot and listened. It was dead silent for nearly a minute. Then I heard something soft and slow, like footsteps on the dry leaves outside. I held my breath. The sound came from the back of the cabin, near the side with no windows. I waited, counting the seconds. Another faint step, then another. Then it stopped. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I convinced myself it was an animal, a deer or something heavier stepping through the brush. But I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. No tracks, no signs of anything, just leaves and old mud. Still, I started leaving my boots and jacket inside at night and keeping the hatchet closer to the cot. By the 5th day, the graveyard started bothering me more. I'd catch myself glancing at it constantly, especially near dusk. Once, I thought I saw someone standing there, just a dark shape behind the stones. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing. My brain was playing tricks, I told myself. That evening, I decided to move my chair to the back wall so I wouldn't have to see the gravestones through the window. I sat there, reading by lantern light, and felt a little better. But just after midnight, the sound came again. Footsteps, slower this time, crunching softly through the leaves, circling. I didn't move, just stared at the door. There was a scraping sound, like something brushing against the wood outside. Then nothing. In the morning, I found 4 small scratches on the far side of the cabin, low to the ground. They weren't deep, and they could have been from an animal, but they looked deliberate. Clean lines, about a foot long, grouped close together. I stopped going on walks after that. The 8th night was the worst. It had rained earlier in the day, and everything smelled like wet dirt and moss. I'd barely eaten, and I kept thinking about the scratches and the sounds. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a loud thump, not outside, but on the side of the cabin. It was sharp and heavy, like someone had struck the wall with a fist or rock. I sat up, heart pounding. Then another thump, this time lower. I grabbed the hatchet and crept to the corner. The lantern flickered. The noise stopped. I waited, breathing shallow. Then I heard something drag slowly across the wall, like fingers running along the wood. It moved from one side to the other, and then silence. I didn't sleep after that, just sat in the corner with my back to the wall, gripping the hatchet. At dawn, I walked out and checked every inch of the exterior. More scratches, a few broken branches near the graveyard. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. I decided to leave the next day. I packed everything back into the car that evening. I planned to leave at first light, but I didn't make it through the night. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, this time faster, circling the cabin over and over. I bolted out of the door with my backpack, ran straight to the car, and peeled off down the overgrown trail, barely missing trees. I drove until sunrise back to Harrison, then all the way home. When I got back, I emailed the guy who'd posted the listing. No reply. I waited a week and emailed again. Nothing. I went back to the forum and found the thread had been deleted. A month later, I looked up the graveyard online using some of the names I remembered from the headstones. I found a single newspaper article from 1982. It mentioned an abandoned cemetery north of Harrison that was under investigation after a hiker reported finding animal bones, makeshift traps, and signs of illegal activity nearby. Nothing came of it. I haven't been back to the woods since. People ask why I don't hike or camp anymore. I usually change the subject, but sometimes I think about those footsteps, those scratches, and the feeling I had in that cabin, that I was being watched the entire time. Not by a ghost, not by anything supernatural, just someone out there still living in the woods, maybe watching that graveyard, maybe waiting for the next idiot to show up alone. And I was lucky to get out before they decided to stop watching. I was 36 the year I transferred out to the Columbia Gorge area in Washington. It was 2014, late October, and the weather had started to shift into those damp, cold patterns that sat heavy in the valley for weeks at a time. I had spent most of my career bouncing between national forests in Oregon and Idaho, but this assignment put me deep into the gorge, far off from the main visitor trails. My job was mostly routine stuff: trail inspections, gate checks, reporting fallen trees, dealing with campers who overstayed their welcome, and in some rare cases, calling in law enforcement when things escalated. This particular stretch of land wasn't popular with tourists. Most people visiting the gorge stuck close to the river or hit the famous viewpoints like Dog Mountain or Beacon Rock. Where I was stationed, it was deeper in. Rough trails, hard access, and dense forest that always seemed to hold more moisture than the trees could shake off. The roads were gravel at best, sometimes just ruts cut into the hills from decades ago. The cabin I was assigned to wasn't much, just a one-room wooden box about 20 miles from the nearest ranger station. No phone reception, no internet, just a weather radio, an old logging stove, and a hand pump for water outside. I was used to isolation, and the quiet usually didn't bother me, but there was something about this place I hadn't settled into yet. Maybe it was how the wind moved through the trees or how fast it got dark after 5 p.m. I told myself it was just new terrain, nothing I hadn't worked through before. I drove out to the cabin on a Tuesday. The department's pickup was packed with my gear, food, propane, spare batteries, my radio, logbooks, and some basic tools. The trail up to the cabin was muddy from rain 2 nights before, and even with 4-wheel drive, the tires spun a few times before catching. When I got to the gate, I had to clear some wet branches that had dropped across the road. The forest felt heavier than usual. I don't mean in a supernatural way, just dense, packed in, the kind of place where sound doesn't carry the same way. Once I parked near the cabin and got the door unlocked, I started setting up. The place smelled like wet wood and old ash. I swept out the corners, unpacked my gear, and fired up the stove to warm it up a bit. It had been used recently. There was a stack of chopped wood just outside under the awning, still dry. That meant one of the other rangers or maybe a fire watch had come through. Nothing unusual. That night it rained. Hard. The wind slapped against the side of the cabin, and the rain hammered the roof like 1,000 small nails. Couldn't sleep well. The stove popped and hissed now and then, and every time a gust of wind came down the slope, it felt like the whole structure shook. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter and listened to the trees groaning. Around 3 a.m., I heard something outside. I didn't move at first, just opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. It wasn't an animal, not the kind of rustling you get from deer or raccoons. This was heavier, steadier, a sound like boots crunching on the wet gravel path that led to the porch. Then it stopped. I stayed in the sleeping bag. I didn't move. I didn't even reach for my flashlight. I just waited, staring at the dark ceiling, listening. I heard nothing for a long while. Maybe I imagined it. I eventually fell back asleep sometime near dawn. The next morning was cold and soaked in fog. I got dressed and stepped out to check the trail and see if anything had moved during the night. The ground was soft, too soft to hold prints well, but near the edge of the porch, I saw some indentations. I crouched down, squinting. Could have been boot prints, could have been nothing, but I knew what I heard. That day, I stuck close to the cabin. I logged a fallen pine down the west trail, cleared a drainage pipe that had backed up near the access road, and checked one of the outbuildings used for storing tools. Everything was in order. Still, I kept looking behind me. The woods felt still and not in a peaceful way. By the time it got dark again, I had the fire going strong and the lantern lit. I ate canned chili, filled out the logbook, and read from an old field guide someone had left behind. The stove popped again, louder this time, and I jumped. My nerves weren't used to this kind of jumpiness. I tried telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. Slow steps, wet ground, then nothing. I stood up and went to the window, just black. The forest didn't give anything back in that kind of dark. I unlocked the cabinet near the back wall and pulled out the old shotgun the department kept for emergencies. It wasn't loaded, I knew that, but I found the shells and loaded 2 in. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the stove and waited, listening. The steps never came back. The wind stayed calm. The rain let up for a few hours. But I kept the shotgun in my lap and my eyes on the door. The next morning, I hiked down to the old service shed about a quarter-mile from the cabin. There was a motion sensor camera mounted there, something installed a year or 2 back during a black bear monitoring program. It only held about 72 hours of memory, so I figured I could maybe catch a glimpse of what had been outside. I pulled the SD card and brought it back to the cabin where I had an old laptop with a card reader. I flipped through the images one by one. Most were empty frames, trees moving, rain falling. But then, 3:12 a.m., the frame caught a blur at the edge of the path. Human-shaped. I clicked forward. The next frame, it was gone. I went cold. There was no scheduled patrol. No other ranger was supposed to be within miles. No campers had permits up here. I checked the logs. Nothing. I reported it in my weekly call that night on the weather band, keeping it brief. Just said I'd seen signs of possible poaching activity and would keep an eye on it. That was safer than saying I had no idea who was walking outside the cabin at night. I stayed another 3 days. Each night I heard the footsteps. Each night they stopped right at the edge of the porch and went silent. I never saw anyone. I never caught them on camera again. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me the whole time. On the 4th day, I drove out early. The road was slick with rain, and the tires slipped a few times. I didn't look back at the cabin when I locked it. I just left. Back at the station, I filled out my report and turned in the SD card. I didn't say what I really thought, that someone was stalking the cabin at night and didn't want to be seen. I left that part out. 2 weeks later, I got a call from one of the regional leads. They'd found another ranger cabin deeper in the same forest had been broken into. Nothing taken, but food had been scattered, and the mattress dragged near the door like someone had slept close to the entrance. They thought it might have been a transient or a hunter who got lost. I didn't say much, just nodded and said I'd keep an eye out next time I was posted up there. But I never went back. I requested a transfer to the Snake River Corridor in Idaho a few months later. Got it without question. I've worked another 10 years since in forests and fire zones, search and rescue operations, and avalanche watch. But I've never had another night like those in Columbia Gorge. That cabin still stands. I looked it up once in a report. Still used. Still remote. They replaced the door 2 years ago after someone had pried it open with a crowbar. Nothing stolen. Just opened and left that way. I don't believe in ghosts. Never have. But I do believe that there are people who live far outside the edges of what we call normal. People who watch. People who know how to move quiet. People who don't want to be found. And some of them, I think, know the ranger patrol schedules better than we do. I still think about that night. I still wonder if whoever it was knew I was awake, or if they were just waiting for a time when I wasn't. It was late October 2013 when I drove up to the cabin near Maple Hollow Ridge. I was 38 that year, single again after my marriage had quietly fallen apart the year before. I wasn't looking to reflect or mourn anything. I just needed a break. A pause from my job, my phone, and the hum of cars outside my apartment window. I'd always liked being alone, and after a couple months of not talking to anyone unless I had to, I felt ready to disappear for a while. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to a friend of a coworker who didn't mind letting someone use it so long as they left it how they found it. It was deep in western Pennsylvania, near a forgotten road that had more moss than pavement left on it. I got the keys in the mail and directions on a torn piece of paper that said, "Turn left after the gas station with the red roof. Go until the road ends. Take the trail to the right. Stay on it. You'll see the mailbox nailed to a tree." I packed light, a cooler with enough food for 5 days, 2 jugs of water, my sleeping bag, a small folding chair, flashlight, a hunting knife I'd bought years ago but never used, and a weatherproof duffel of clothes. I left my phone behind. That was intentional. I didn't want even the temptation to check it. The drive out there was quiet. I didn't see a single car for nearly an hour after I left the highway. Trees crowded the shoulders, their leaves half off from the recent rains and wind, making the roads look more like trails. When I got to the end of that moss-covered road, I pulled off to the side and locked up my truck. I found the tree with the rusted mailbox. The trail was narrow, uneven, and sloped upward gently. I had to stop twice to catch my breath, the duffel starting to dig into my shoulder. After maybe 25 minutes, the trees opened up a little and I saw the roof of the cabin through the thinning canopy. It was smaller than I expected. Not much more than a square with a porch. No paint, just grayed, weathered wood. The windows were old, the glass thick and slightly warped. I stepped up on the porch and opened the door using the small key that had come with the note. Stuck in the lock a bit, but it turned. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The air smelled like dry wood and a little mildew. It was cool and still. There was one room that served as both the living and sleeping space. A cot with a foam mattress stood in one corner, a small table in the other. An old wood stove sat near the center. There was no bathroom. I knew I'd be using the woods. I set my gear down and checked the place out. No electricity, no plumbing. A few dusty mason jars lined the shelf near the window. I found a small hatchet and a stack of firewood beside the stove. Everything was as simple and bare as it could be. That first night, I didn't do much. I made a fire in the stove, listened to the crackling, and sat on the floor with my back against the wall. The silence hit me in a way I hadn't expected. I realized how loud my life had been until that moment. Even the woods around the cabin barely made a sound. I fell asleep early, sometime after sunset, which came quickly through the thick trees. I didn't dream, or if I did, I don't remember any of it. The second day, I walked around a bit. There were no marked trails beyond the one I came in on, but the woods weren't too dense to explore. The ground was soft, covered in layers of wet leaves. I carried the knife just in case I stepped on something I shouldn't have. I didn't see any big wildlife, just squirrels, a few birds, and some fresh deer scat. The air had a sharpness to it, the kind of smell that says the first frost isn't far away. That afternoon, I sat out on the porch with my chair. No cars, no sounds of planes. Just me, the woods, and the wind brushing through branches. I felt calm in a way I hadn't felt for years. I was finally out of reach of anything that could demand something from me. But that night, something changed. I woke up to a noise, a soft thump outside. I opened my eyes and just laid there, listening. I thought it might be a branch falling or an animal walking past the cabin. But then there was another thump, heavier this time, more like something stepping onto the porch. I didn't move. I just laid there in my sleeping bag, my heart starting to pick up speed. Then there was another sound, metal on wood, like something brushing or tapping near the door. I quietly reached for the knife. My eyes were still adjusting to the dark, but I could see the outline of the window from the faint moonlight. The sounds stopped. I sat there for at least an hour, barely breathing, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I checked the porch. Nothing was out of place. No tracks, no marks on the door. I figured maybe a raccoon or something had gotten curious. Still, I didn't sleep much the next night. On the third day, I didn't stray far from the cabin. I kept having the feeling that someone was watching me, even though I hadn't seen or heard anything. Around noon, I walked down to the edge of the ridge that the cabin sat near. It dropped off into a steep, rocky slope, thick with trees below. I looked down and saw what looked like an old trail weaving along the bottom of the ridge. It wasn't obvious, half overgrown, like no one had used it in years. I made a mental note of it and went back inside. That night it rained, light at first, then heavier after midnight. I sat inside listening to the soft tapping of rain on the roof, then the harder drumming as the storm picked up. I had the fire going low, just enough to keep warm. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard that sound again, the thump on the porch. This time it was followed by a dragging sound. Not fast, not loud, but enough to make me sit up. The knife was already under my pillow. I slipped it into my hand and moved closer to the stove, sitting on the floor. I thought maybe it was a tree limb that had fallen and slid off the roof. But then I heard it again. Another slow drag, like something being pulled across the wooden planks just outside. I stayed frozen. The sound stopped, then started again on the other side of the cabin, like someone or something had moved from one end of the porch to the other. I held my breath. The fire had died down, and the room was nearly pitch black. I didn't dare light the lantern. Nothing else happened. After another hour, the rain eased up. I heard only the dripping of water from the edge of the roof. Eventually, I fell asleep sitting against the wall. In the morning, I checked the porch. Still nothing. No tracks, no marks. But on the edge of the steps, I saw something odd. One of the split logs that had been stacked neatly beside the stove was lying halfway off the edge, like someone had tried to move it. It didn't look like it fell. It looked placed there. That's when I started to feel truly unsettled. I didn't pack up or leave, but something in the air had shifted. I kept the knife on me all day. I didn't walk beyond the clearing. I felt watched even when I was inside. Late that afternoon, just before sunset, I heard a noise from behind the cabin. A dry snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. I stepped outside and stood perfectly still on the porch. The woods were quiet, too quiet. The wind had stopped, and I couldn't hear a single bird. I waited a few minutes, then slowly walked around the side of the cabin. The ground was wet from the night's rain, and I looked for prints, but there weren't any, just wet leaves and dark dirt. Then I noticed something down near the slope, near where I'd seen that old trail at the bottom of the ridge. There was a shape maybe 50 yards down. It wasn't moving. Could have been a fallen log or a rock, but something about it caught my attention. It didn't belong. I watched it for a long time. It never moved. Eventually, I went back inside and shut the door. That night, I barely slept. I kept the knife on my chest. I didn't light the fire. I wanted the darkness to hide me. At some point in the early morning, I heard footsteps. Not on the porch this time, out in the woods. Slow, deliberate crunches through leaves. It didn't come closer, but it circled. Once, twice, then nothing. When the sun finally came up, I made my decision. I was gonna leave a day early. I packed everything quickly, stuffing my clothes and gear into the duffel. I didn't eat, didn't sit. I just got ready to hike back out. But as I stepped off the porch, I noticed something on the tree near the mailbox trail. 3 deep gouges. Fresh, like they'd been made by a blade or something sharp. The wood was clean, not weathered like the rest of the trunk. And they were at eye level, deliberate. I didn't stick around to figure it out. I started down the trail and didn't stop. The hike back felt longer. The woods felt heavier. Every twig snap made me jump. I kept glancing behind me, convinced I'd see someone following, but I didn't. When I reached my truck, I nearly dropped the keys getting the door open. I threw the duffel in and got out of there. I didn't look back. Back in town, I didn't tell anyone what happened. I returned the key, said thank you, and that was it. A month later, I heard from the coworker that their friend had found the door to the cabin slightly open when they went up. Nothing was taken, but they also found the stack of logs beside the stove knocked over, and an old pocket knife stuck deep into one of the porch posts. That was over a decade ago now. I haven't gone back into the woods since. Not alone. It was September 2018 when I decided to leave Phoenix behind for a while. I was 33 back then. I'd been working a desk job for 9 years, nothing crazy, just finance work for a mid-sized firm. My girlfriend had left me earlier that summer, and I'd been staying in my buddy's apartment for a few months. I was burned out, tired of the city, tired of my phone always buzzing, and I just wanted to disappear for a bit. So when my Uncle Jim offered me the keys to a remote cabin in northern Arizona that belonged to his late friend, I didn't think twice. It wasn't a fancy place, just an old one-room wooden cabin surrounded by thick pine forest, sitting about 20 miles from the nearest small town called Munns Park. No electricity, no plumbing, no neighbors for miles. Just a small propane stove, a cot, a wood-burning heater, and a rain barrel for washing. You had to hike in the last mile and a half after driving up a rutted-out Forest Service road that wasn't even marked on Google Maps. That's exactly what I wanted: quiet, space, and no people. I packed up 3 weeks' worth of supplies. Cans, rice, oats, jerky, trail mix, that kind of stuff. Brought a good knife, 2 flashlights, a hand crank radio, a solar charger, and my dad's old Ruger .22 just in case. Not that I thought I'd need it, but it made me feel better. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just told my buddy Zach I was going up north to camp and needed space. That was it. The drive took 5 hours. I left early in the morning, watched the city fade in my rearview mirror, and by noon I was pulling off the highway and bumping my way up that rough trail. I parked where the trees got too dense and finished the trip on foot. It was dead quiet up there. No wind, no distant highway hum, just the sound of my boots crunching on pine needles. The cabin looked exactly like the picture Uncle Jim had shown me. A slanted tin roof, faded brown walls, and a small porch barely hanging on. Inside was dusty and smelled like old wood and mouse droppings, but it was dry and still. A cot sat in one corner with a rolled-up blanket on top. A beat-up old table and 2 chairs were pushed against the wall. A few shelves held jars of nails, matches, a couple of empty tin cans, and an old Coleman lantern. No signs of anything alive. I settled in quick, unpacked, swept out the worst of the dust, aired out the blanket, and filled up the rain barrel with a few gallons I'd brought in. There was no cell signal, but I liked that. For the first time in a while, I felt a little peace. The first few days were normal. I hiked a lot, chopped wood, sat in the sun. I slept early and woke up with the light. My days were full but simple. I read an old paperback novel I found on the shelf. I wrote a little in a notepad I brought. I cooked basic meals and boiled water to stay clean. It was the fourth night when something started to feel strange. That evening I'd gone on a short hike before sunset, just exploring the ridge behind the cabin. I came across a small clearing with some old logs set in a square, like a fire ring. Looked like someone had camped there years ago. No signs of recent use. I poked around for a minute, then headed back before it got too dark. When I reached the cabin, the front door was open. I stopped right there. I knew I had latched it. It didn't lock. It just had a metal latch you could slip from the outside, but I always made sure to close it tight. The door wasn't blown open either. It was swung fully wide like someone had walked in and left it that way. I walked slowly toward it, heart thumping harder with every step. I held my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. The inside looked undisturbed.
No mess, no smell, no sounds.
I stepped in and cleared the small room quickly, even peeked under the cot and behind the woodpile. Nothing, just me. I shut the door, relatched it, and sat down to calm my breathing. I didn't sleep much that night. Every small sound outside felt louder than usual. Branches snapping, wind brushing through the pines, the occasional far-off rustle. I kept the flashlight and the point too close. The next morning, I convinced myself it had just been the wind. Maybe I hadn't latched it fully. It was an old cabin. Things didn't always work right. I tried not to let it bother me, but the next night it happened again. This time it wasn't just the door. When I came back from gathering wood around dusk, I saw fresh footprints in the dirt near the porch. They weren't mine. Mine were boot prints, deep and wide. These were different, smaller, thinner, looked like worn-down sneakers. 2 sets. They led from the edge of the trees toward the cabin, circled the porch once, and disappeared behind the cabin toward the back. I stood frozen, staring at them, the forest suddenly silent around me. My mind raced. Who the hell would be out here? I hadn't seen a single person in 4 days. There were no roads, no houses, no trails near here. You'd have to really want to get here. I followed the prints around the cabin but lost them in the harder ground. They didn't come back out the other side. That night, I didn't go to sleep. I sat in the chair, gun on my lap, lantern low. At some point past midnight, I heard movement outside. Light, quick footsteps. Then a soft thump near the back of the cabin wall. I froze. I didn't move for at least 10 minutes, just listening. There was no follow-up.
No knocking, no voices.
Just silence again. At first light, I stepped out and checked the back wall. More prints, closer to the window. Whoever it was had been standing right there. I considered leaving, packing up and hiking out, but I didn't want to feel chased off. I wanted to believe it was just a random hiker passing through. Maybe teenagers screwing around. Maybe they were gone already. That afternoon, I went farther into the woods than before, trying to find signs of anyone camping nearby. I hiked for hours and didn't see a single tent, tarp, or fire ring, just woods. But when I came back, a bundle of my food was gone. Someone had gone through my supplies and taken 3 cans of beans, half a bag of trail mix, and one of my water bottles. They'd left everything else.
No mess.
Just quiet, careful theft. That's when I knew it wasn't some harmless kid. Whoever it was had waited for me to leave, watched me, walked in and taken what they wanted. I set a trap that night. Nothing serious, just a string with a bell tied across the porch, connected to a few old nails I found. I also buried one of my flashlights under the dirt, with just the lens peeking out to see if anyone came near the steps. At around 2 a.m., the bell jingled once. Not loud, just a soft single chime. I sat up instantly, holding the gun tight, heart pounding. The light I'd buried outside caught the shape of someone moving past it. Just the edge of a leg, then gone. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just waited. Nothing happened. No one came inside. No more sounds. By sunrise, there was no one in sight. The next day, I left a note on the porch, written in big block letters. I'm here.
I'm armed.
I will defend myself. I don't know why I thought that would work. Felt stupid, but it was the only thing I could think of. But they didn't care. That night, they came again. This time, I heard footsteps on the roof. Slow, deliberate steps. I sat there frozen, staring up at the ceiling while the boards creaked above me. Then I heard something drop down by the window. A soft clink, like a nail or piece of glass. I crept over, pulled the curtain back just a bit, and saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the trees. Not moving, just standing there watching. They didn't move for what felt like 10 minutes, just stood in the shadows. Then, slowly, they turned and walked back into the woods. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I packed up everything I could carry and left behind the rest. I hiked fast, never looking back, until I reached my car. When I turned the key and the engine started, I almost cried. The drive back down felt like leaving a nightmare behind. I never went back. I told Uncle Jim what happened, but he just shrugged and said, "Yeah, that area's weird. That was it." I still don't know who those people were. They didn't try to hurt me, but they didn't want me there. And they knew how to move, how to hide, how to get close without being heard. They weren't random hikers. They'd been living out there somewhere, watching. I think about that trip often. I went there to be alone, to find quiet. But I wasn't alone. And I'll never forget the feeling I had when I realized someone had known I was there the entire time. Watching, waiting, moving around me without making a sound. That kind of quiet isn't peace. It's danger. It was late September 2022 when I decided to leave Denver for a while and head out to a small cabin my uncle used to own in the forests near Red Feather Lakes, Colorado. I was 29 at the time. I'd just gone through a break-in at my apartment 2 weeks before, and I couldn't sleep right since. The cops never found who did it. They stole some things, nothing irreplaceable, but it was more the feeling of it. The idea that someone had come into my home, gone through my drawers, and stood in the same room where I slept. Couldn't shake it. Every night I kept waking up to little sounds and shadows. I took my dog Max with me. He's a German Shepherd mix, about 4 years old, around 80 pounds, smart and loyal. He had a way of making me feel a little more protected, like he could sense things before I could. And I think after the break-in, he was feeling on edge too. He kept sniffing around the front door every night like he expected that man to come back. The cabin was old but solid. It sat about 5 miles off the main road down a gravel path that barely looked like a road anymore. My uncle had passed away in 2019, and no one in the family had touched the place since. It didn't have internet, no phone signal unless I walked up the hill behind it, and only a little propane heater that still worked. But it was quiet, and it was away from the city, and I figured maybe I'd sleep better out there. I packed enough groceries for 10 days, brought a few books, and planned on spending my time walking the trails with Max and trying to relax. I didn't bring a gun, which I would later regret. I had a decent hunting knife, but I'd never used it for more than cutting rope and slicing jerky. The first couple days were good. The air was crisp but not cold. Trees were just starting to turn yellow and orange. Every morning I'd drink coffee on the porch while Max sniffed around the edge of the trees, tail wagging. At night I'd hear owls and branches cracking, normal forest stuff. The wind would pick up sometimes, and the trees would sway like they were talking to each other. By the fourth night, something started to feel wrong. I woke up around 2 a.m. because Max was growling. low, deep in his chest. He was standing by the door, ears forward, body tense. I couldn't hear anything at first, but when I sat up and held my breath, I thought I could just barely make out a crunch outside, like footsteps on dead leaves. Not fast, just one every few seconds. Slow, careful. I stayed frozen in bed, heart beating loud in my ears. Max didn't bark, which somehow made it worse. He just stood there like a statue. I waited for a long time before it stopped. Then silence again. I didn't sleep after that. Just lay there watching the ceiling in the dark until the sky outside started turning gray. The next day, I walked around the cabin with Max. I didn't see any boot prints, just deer tracks and some smaller animal prints I couldn't identify. But Max kept sniffing in one spot by the back corner of the cabin, then looking out into the woods like he was following a scent trail. That night, I kept the knife close. On the 6th day, I hiked up the hill behind the cabin to make a phone call and check messages. No cell signal in the cabin, like I said, but halfway up the slope, I usually got a bar or two. I called my sister, told her everything was fine, and started heading back down around 3:30 in the afternoon. That's when I noticed it, just off the trail about 30 feet in, something white sticking out of the dirt. I thought it was trash at first. I pushed through the brush and found a large, white plastic container, mostly buried. It was like one of those 5-gallon food storage buckets, the kind with the rubber seal on top. It had no labels. I tried opening it, but the lid wouldn't budge. It looked like someone had sealed it shut with something. I kicked some dirt off of it and noticed fresh drag marks in the leaves leading toward it. Something had been pulled here not that long ago. I felt uneasy, but I told myself it could be anything. Someone storing supplies. Hunters, maybe. But then I looked around and realized this wasn't near any trail or camp. It was deep in the trees, and there were no tire tracks or signs of human presence nearby. I marked the spot in my head, then hurried back to the cabin. That night it rained, hard. The wind picked up and slammed against the windows like it was trying to get in.
Max was restless.
Around 11 p.m., he started whining. Not barking, not growling, just pacing back and forth near the door, ears back, tail stiff. Something out there had him scared. I looked out the window with a flashlight but couldn't see anything through the rain. At one point, the motion light out back flicked on. I froze. It hadn't come on the whole week. I crept to the back window and peeked through the side of the curtain. Nothing moved, just rain falling in the beam of the light. But Max was staring out the same direction, his body still and tense. He didn't make a sound. After maybe 2 minutes, the light clicked off again. Max eventually came back and laid next to my cot, but neither of us slept that night. The next morning, I went back up the hill. I don't know why. Maybe I felt like if I didn't check that white bucket again, it would just sit in my mind like a weight. But when I got there, it was gone. Just gone. There were drag marks in the dirt again. The exact spot where the bucket had been was a flattened circle of wet leaves and exposed soil. Something or someone had come and taken it. And recently, the rain hadn't erased the marks yet. That afternoon, I started thinking about leaving. The cabin had no real locks, just a wooden bar you could slide across the door. It never mattered before, but now I was looking at the corners of the room differently, double-checking the windows. I moved one of the small dressers in front of the front door before dark. Around midnight, Max started growling again. Not from the door this time, but the back window. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the glass. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. Then I saw it, just for a second, a flash of something pale behind a tree, human-sized. I turned off the flashlight right away and stepped back. My heart was pounding in my throat. I stood there in the dark for maybe 10 minutes. Then I heard it. Footsteps.
Actual footsteps.
Not an animal, not a deer. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They circled around the cabin. Max stood beside me the whole time, his body low, ready to lunge. I gripped the knife so tight my hand cramped. The steps circled once, twice, then nothing. The next morning I saw prints. Not boots, bare feet. I swear to God, someone had walked barefoot through the forest in the rain in 40-degree weather to get to that cabin. The prints were wide, with long toes, deep in the mud like whoever it was had real weight to them. They led from the trees around the cabin and then vanished back into the woods. That's when I decided I was done. I packed up everything by noon. I didn't care how much food I had left. I loaded the car and had Max in the front seat. But before I left, I walked the perimeter one last time. I needed to know if I was just losing it. When I reached the back corner of the cabin, I found something stuck to the wall with a rusty nail. It was a strip of duct tape about a foot long, and on it, stuck firmly, were several long strands of hair. Human hair, wet, tangled, dark brown. I didn't wait another minute. I got in the car and drove all the way back to Denver without stopping. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe it? There was no crime, no body, no evidence of anything. Just some footprints and hair and a gut feeling that something had been watching me out there. Maybe more than one thing. I still don't know what the bucket was or what was inside it. I never told the police. I figured they wouldn't investigate a vague story about a bucket in the woods and a man with bare feet. I looked up missing persons in that area, found 2 reports from a year earlier, both hikers, both unsolved. Could be nothing, could be everything. I haven't gone back since. The cabin's still there. My uncle's name is still on the deed. But I don't care. That place isn't safe. I don't even let Max near the woods anymore. He still reacts to certain smells, certain sounds, like he's remembering something too. I sleep okay now, mostly, but sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'll wake up with that same tightness in my chest. I'll look around the room just to make sure no one's there, and I'll think about those footsteps in the rain, that pale shape behind the trees, the missing bucket, and the hair. Something is out there in those woods, something human, or close enough to it, and it was watching me the whole time. It was late October 2019 when I drove out to a patch of wooded land I'd bought earlier that summer in northern Georgia, about an hour west of Blue Ridge. I was 32 at the time, working freelance doing carpentry, handyman work, and small restoration jobs. Things had slowed down a bit that fall, so I figured it was the right time to start building a small off-grid cabin I'd been planning for months. I wasn't aiming for anything big or fancy, just something small, maybe 12 by 14 feet, enough for a bed, a small wood stove, and a little workbench. Somewhere quiet to escape the phone, bills, and people for a while. I brought all the basics with me in the bed of my old Silverado. Plywood, treated 2x4S, nails, screws, basic hand tools, a chainsaw, a gas generator, and a few tarps. My plan was to sleep in the truck or under a tarp while I got the cabin shell up. I had built plenty of things in bad weather, so a little rain wouldn't stop me. The weather report had mentioned a possible cold front with rain that night, but I didn't think much of it. I figured if I worked fast, I could at least get the frame up and throw a tarp over it before dark. The spot I picked for the cabin sat on a slope above a dry creek bed, surrounded by oak and pine. It was far enough from the dirt road to be hidden, but close enough that I could walk to the truck if I needed anything. I cleared the brush in late summer, so the ground was already leveled and staked. That afternoon, I worked steadily as the clouds rolled in. The air had that thick smell of wet leaves and distant rain, the kind that makes your skin feel like it's already damp before a drop falls. I cut the sill plates and raised the floor frame by 3 p.m., laid the plywood down by 4:30, and had the wall frames upright and loosely braced by 6 o'clock. The sky had gone slate gray, and the wind started moving through the trees like low thunder. I kept glancing up, checking the light. I needed at least another hour to secure the walls and hang a tarp overhead. But the rain came fast, started with mist, then became steady. Within 10 minutes, it turned into a cold, slanted downpour. My jacket got soaked through almost immediately, and the plywood under my boots turned slick. I didn't want to leave the frame half done overnight, so I pressed on, hammering nails with rainwater running down my face. I managed to get one large tarp stretched across the top of the frame, tied down with rope, and weighed at the corners with rocks and scrap wood. By 7:30, it was dark. Not dusk, full darkness. The kind where you can't see your hand in front of your face without a flashlight. And I hadn't set up my lanterns or battery lights yet. I only had a headlamp, which I wore over my wet cap, and that beam of light just made the shadows sharper around the trees. I sat down on the floor of the half-built cabin, wiped the rain off my face, and caught my breath. The frame creaked a little in the wind, but it held. I heard the tarp snapping above me and the sound of water dripping in thick, heavy drops onto the plywood. The temperature had dropped fast. My hands were stiff and numb, even with gloves. I knew I needed to get warm and dry, but the idea of crawling into the truck, soaked as I was, didn't sit right with me. I figured I'd huddle under the tarp for a while and wait it out. I unrolled my foam mat and sleeping bag in the driest corner and tried to get comfortable. It wasn't easy. Every gust of wind shook the tarp, and the sound of rain drumming on plastic made it hard to relax. I wasn't scared, at least not at first. I camped alone in worse conditions. But something about that night felt off in a way I couldn't name. It started with the feeling of being watched. I know how that sounds, but I mean it in a literal sense. I was lying on my side, head against my rolled-up jacket, when I felt it. A shift in the air, like something had changed outside the walls. The rain hadn't stopped, but there was a break in the wind, a pause in the rhythm of the storm. I sat up and clicked on my headlamp again. Nothing, just rain, trees, and blackness. I figured maybe a deer had wandered through, or a raccoon. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was nearby. I didn't hear footsteps or twigs snapping, but I kept looking toward the open side of the frame, the one without a wall yet. That part faced downhill toward the creek bed. The beam from my headlamp barely reached the tree line. My heart was beating harder than it should have been. Then I saw it. Not a person, not an animal, just something strange. Two little reflections like eyes low to the ground, maybe 30 feet out. They didn't move. They just sat there, shining back at me from the undergrowth. I stayed still, squinting into the dark, trying to see if they blinked or shifted. I waited, not breathing. My fingers closed around the handle of my hatchet, which I'd left beside me. I know it wasn't a good weapon, but it was something. The reflections vanished. No sound, no movement, just gone. I stood up and scanned the woods with the light, sweeping slowly from left to right. Rain kept falling, steady and cold, soaking the plywood and my clothes. My boots felt like they weighed 10 pounds each. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't relax. I didn't lie back down. I stayed up, pacing back and forth in the cabin shell, teeth chattering, listening. Around 9 o'clock, I heard something heavier. Came from down the hill toward the creek bed. A branch snapped, then another. Something was definitely moving out there. I turned off the headlamp and crouched by the edge of the floor, straining to listen. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, careful, but not quiet enough to be an animal. They stopped for a while, then started again, moving closer. Then they stopped completely. I waited a long time, maybe half an hour. Nothing. When I finally turned the light back on, I checked the area around the cabin again. Still no signs of anything, but I couldn't shake that creeping tension, that deep instinct that something wasn't right. I felt like if I stepped off the plywood and walked into the trees, something would grab me. Something real, something human. By 11 o'clock, the rain had lightened up a little. My generator was back in the truck, and I thought about hiking up to grab it, but I didn't want to walk out into the dark. Not after what I thought I saw. I stayed inside the frame, cold and tired, but alert. And that's when I saw the boot prints. They weren't mine. I had been careful not to track mud onto the floor. These were fresh, wet prints leading from the open side of the cabin, across the plywood, and stopping a few feet from where I had been lying earlier. There were 4 of them. Then they vanished, no exit prints, no drag marks, just 4 dark, wet impressions in the plywood. Then nothing. I stared at them for a long time. Then I packed my sleeping bag, grabbed my axe, and left. I didn't run, but I moved fast, backed away, careful not to turn my back fully to the woods. I reached the truck, got in, locked the doors, and didn't sleep. Just sat there in the driver's seat with my hands in my lap, soaked to the bone, engine off, windows fogging, and the axe still clutched in one hand. I waited until the sun started to rise, until I could see the trees again without artificial light. When I finally stepped back out, I walked to the cabin with a knot in my stomach. The plywood floor was still wet, but the prints had started to fade. The storm had blown through. The woods looked normal again. I checked the whole area, walked the perimeter, found no more prints, no garbage, no signs of camping, nothing. But I knew what I saw. Someone had been there. Someone came into that half-built cabin in the middle of the night while I was inside it, and they left without a sound. I didn't stay to finish the build. I packed my tools into the truck bed, tied them down, and left. I didn't even eat breakfast, just drove. A few weeks later, I came back with a friend from work and a shotgun. We finished the cabin over 3 weekends, and I never spent a night there alone again. I added a door with a steel latch, motion lights, and even a camera inside. Nothing ever happened again. Not a single sign of trespass. But I still think about that night. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. And because if I'd fallen asleep just 10 minutes earlier, or left my axe in the truck, I don't know if I'd have woken up again. I was 34 when I decided to take a week off work and spend it in the backwoods of northern Arizona. It was late October, 2019. The nights were getting cold, and I wanted to be somewhere quiet, far from everything. No phones, no people, no traffic. I had been dealing with a lot at the time. Some family stuff, some work stress, just the usual pressure that builds up until you feel like you're always one sharp word away from losing it. I thought a week alone in a cabin would clear my head. I rented a small hunting cabin just south of Marble Canyon, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. It was deep in Kaibab National Forest, sitting just above a dried-out wash and surrounded on 3 sides by pines and big flat stretches of sage and dirt. The road to get there was gravel for about 12 miles after turning off the highway, and by the time I arrived in my truck late afternoon, I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. The cabin was old but solid. It had a little front porch, a tin roof, and a generator wired for minimal electricity, just enough to keep lights on and the small fridge running. No TV, no internet, and no cell service. The outhouse was about 20 feet behind it, and a rusty water tank sat near the back, gravity-fed from a small cistern up the hill. Inside, there was a small wood stove, a table, a single bed with a thin mattress, and a few shelves stocked with canned food and basics. I brought my own gear, sleeping bag, gas lantern, a 12-gauge Mossberg I kept mostly for bear or cougar if it came to that, and enough food and bottled water for a week. I also had a field journal I sometimes used to write in when I couldn't sleep. I liked being out there. No sound but the wind. Nothing fake. Just the land, the cold air, and myself. That first night was calm. I set up everything inside, chopped a bit of wood, and sat on the porch drinking coffee from my thermos as the sun dropped low behind the trees. The sky turned that sharp orange then purple, and the temperature fell hard as soon as the last light slipped. I went inside, started a fire in the stove, and lay down early. Slept through the night without waking up once. The second day was quiet, too. I walked around the property, hiked about a mile up a hill to get a view of the surrounding forest, and came back to the cabin by early afternoon. I spent some time reading and writing in the journal, then sat outside again until it got too cold. The wind picked up after sunset, and I heard a few branches crack far off through the trees, but nothing too unusual. Sound carries weird in the woods. You can't always tell how far something is. It was on the third night that I felt it. I woke up around 2 a.m. to what I thought was scratching. Not loud, but steady. I lay there, not moving, just listening. The fire had died down. I couldn't see much, only the red glow from the stove. I stayed still for a few minutes, hearing nothing else. Then I heard it again, like nails or fingers scraping wood. I grabbed my flashlight, sat up slowly, and swept the beam across the cabin. Nothing inside. I stood and moved to the window, careful not to make noise. I tilted the beam through the glass. Nothing. I didn't open the door. I didn't want to. I just stood there a long time, listening. Eventually, I went back to bed, but I didn't fall back asleep. The next morning, I went outside and looked around the porch. The dirt was dry, but near the steps I saw some marks. They didn't look like boot prints. They were uneven, long, like bare feet, but not quite right. No clear toes, no tread pattern. Just long shapes pressed shallow into the dirt. Could have been an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer. Maybe the wind. Still, something felt wrong. It's hard to explain unless you've been alone in the woods. Sometimes it's just a feeling, like you're being watched, like there's something just out of sight. I kept my shotgun closer after that. That afternoon, I walked a loop around the cabin, wider than usual, about a half-mile out. I wanted to see if there were tracks or signs of animals nearby. I didn't find much, but once, near a cluster of boulders, I found what looked like a scrap of torn fabric caught on a bush. It was black, maybe denim, stiff like it had been there a while. I left it alone. When I got back to the cabin, everything looked untouched. But when I went inside, I felt like something had been moved. It was a small thing. The lantern on the table wasn't facing the way I'd left it. My backpack strap was twisted. Things like that. Could have been me. Could have been nothing. I didn't sleep well that night. Around 1 a.m., I woke to footsteps on the porch. Slow. One step. Then nothing. Then another. I sat up, holding the shotgun. I didn't move otherwise. The steps creaked like weight was shifting slowly on the boards. It walked from one end of the porch to the other, then stopped. I held my breath. After a long time, I heard it step down off the porch. No running, no noise after that. I didn't hear it walk away. It was just gone. When daylight came, I went out fast, looking for tracks. I saw them again, those same weird, long bear prints. More of them this time, going around the cabin and down toward the trees. I followed them maybe 50 yards before they vanished into harder dirt. I stayed close to the cabin the rest of the day, kept the shotgun nearby at all times. I started keeping the lantern lit through the night and sleeping in my boots. I didn't even write in my journal that day. I just sat on the porch watching the woods, listening. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around midnight, I heard something breathing, not an animal sound. It was deep and human, but wrong. It was outside the cabin, close to the window, just breathing, slow and steady. Then it stopped. I crept to the window and looked out. Nothing. But when I turned around, I saw something move across the window on the opposite side of the cabin. Just a shadow, a flash of movement. I backed into the corner, shotgun pointed at the door. My hands were shaking. I waited there for what felt like hours. Then I heard it again, those slow steps on the porch. It moved to the door, stopped, and then knock. One knock, slow, heavy, then silence. I didn't answer. I didn't make a sound. It left. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to leave. I packed up everything fast, loaded the truck, and was ready to pull out when I noticed something on the driver's side window. A handprint, but it wasn't a full hand. It had only 4 fingers, long and narrow.
No thumb.
It was smudged in dirt or grease. Whatever it was, it hadn't been there the day before. I drove out of there as fast as I could without wrecking my truck on the gravel road. Didn't stop until I hit pavement. Didn't stop again until I was 50 miles south, near Flagstaff. I told myself it was a trespasser, maybe someone living off-grid, someone unstable. But the prints, the breathing, the hand, I couldn't make sense of it. A week later, back at home, I got a call from the man who owned the cabin. He said the ranger he sent out to check the place had found something odd. A dead coyote, skinned and nailed to a tree behind the cabin. Said it looked recent. Said maybe hunters had left it. But I could hear it in his voice. He didn't believe that either. I never went back, and for a long time I didn't talk about it. But some nights I still hear that breathing. And sometimes, when I park my truck outside my apartment, I think I see a smudge on the window, just for a second. Something that looks like a hand, but not quite, not human, and always watching. It was early October of 2017 when I decided to rent a remote cabin deep in the western part of Montana. I had just turned 34. Life was getting to me. The noise of the city, the constant pressure of work, the people, the notifications, the non-stop everything. I was working a stressful job in a digital design agency in Seattle, and it had burned me out to the core. I was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. I just wanted some silence and time alone. No phone.
No laptop.
No people. Just trees, maybe a river, and a solid roof over my head. I found the listing on a small rental site for backcountry cabins. This one was in Beaverhead County, near a place called Grant. Just a dot on the map. It sat about 9 miles up a dirt road from the nearest paved highway and about 60 miles from the nearest town with any real services. The listing had pictures: simple log cabin, 1 room with stove, outhouse, well, small shed out back. No internet, no electricity, just propane lamps and a hand pump for water. Exactly what I wanted. I booked it for 2 weeks. I packed up my old Subaru with food, warm clothes, a first aid kit, a hunting knife, a flashlight, some bear spray, a few paperbacks, a field journal, and a pair of hiking boots. I left Seattle before sunrise and drove the 12 hours to Dillon, the nearest town with gas and groceries. From there, I filled up the tank, bought extra food, and followed the directions printed on the cabin listing. I lost phone signal about 40 minutes out. The dirt road to the cabin wasn't maintained, full of ruts and rocks, but I made it. I reached the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the ridge. The place was smaller than I imagined, but solid. The logs were weathered but tightly fitted. The front door was heavy and stiff, and the windows were thick-paned with wooden shutters. Inside, it was 1 room, with stove in the center, a cot in the corner, a small table, 2 chairs, some open shelves with old pans and dishes, and a big trunk that held extra blankets. The floor creaked underfoot. There was a woodpile stacked neatly on the left side of the cabin, and behind it was the outhouse and a small locked shed. The quiet hit me in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of stillness.
No humming refrigerators.
No cars, no people, just the wind brushing through the dry grass, the occasional chirp of a bird, the soft rustle of pine needles. It was perfect. I unpacked, settled in, and made a simple meal of canned beans and crackers. The stove took a bit of work to get going, but once I figured out the damper and airflow, it warmed the whole place quickly. That night, I slept harder than I had in months. I didn't wake up once. The next few days were calm and slow. I spent my mornings hiking the hills nearby, writing in my journal, collecting dry wood, and just being still. I didn't see another soul, not even a passing vehicle on the far road. I spotted elk scat, fresh deer prints, and a set of bear tracks along the edge of a stream, but nothing alarming. I kept the bear spray close just in case. Every day ended with a fire, a hot meal, and an early bedtime. It was exactly what I'd come for. On the 6th day, something changed. Started small. I woke up just after midnight needing to use the outhouse. I pulled on my boots and jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside. The night was cold and perfectly silent. I didn't bother shining the light at first. I knew the short path well by now. But when I got halfway to the outhouse, I smelled something strange. Not just outhouse smell. This was sharper. A mix of sweat, damp earth, and something sour. Almost like old meat. I stopped, listened. Nothing. I figured maybe a raccoon or a fox had come by. Still, I clicked on my flashlight and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. The smell was strong for a moment, then faded. I finished up and went back inside, locked the door behind me. Didn't think much of it. The next day, I decided to hike farther east, beyond the ridge. I packed lunch and left after breakfast. It was a beautiful hike. Golden aspen leaves, crisp air, no sounds but the crunch of my boots. I climbed to a high bluff and sat there for a while just staring at the valley below. I spotted a small cabin across the distant slope. Not the one I was staying in, but a much older, more broken down one. Maybe a trapper's cabin or an old ranger outpost. I marked it on my map and decided to maybe check it out in a few days. On the way back, near the ridge, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a pile of bones. Not fresh, but not old either. Maybe 2 weeks. Small animal, maybe a deer fawn or a goat. Picked clean. But what really caught me was that the skull had been placed on top of the pile, like it had been deliberately arranged. And nearby, I found a rope. Just a piece, maybe 2 feet long, with a frayed end and what looked like dried blood on one side. I stood there for a long time staring at that pile. The woods were quiet, but not in the peaceful way. Felt like the silence was watching me. I didn't touch anything, just backed away and returned to the cabin before sunset. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the cabin made my heart skip. I kept the lantern on low, my knife and bear spray beside me. Nothing happened. Morning came, and I convinced myself it was just a predator stash or maybe some hunter's odd way of marking something. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. 2 days later, things got worse. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up to a noise. A soft, dragging sound, like something heavy was being pulled across the porch. I froze, listening. Then another sound, a dull thud, like someone bumping into the wall. I didn't move. My hand slowly reached for the flashlight. I turned it on, shining it toward the door. I didn't see anything through the window. I stayed there for what felt like hours. Eventually, the noise stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked the porch. Nothing. No marks, no tracks. The ground was hard-packed dirt, so maybe it didn't leave any. But as I walked around the side of the cabin, I found something that made my skin crawl. Someone had stacked 3 rocks in a triangle shape right next to the fire pit. Perfectly balanced. They hadn't been there the day before. I didn't touch them. I thought about packing up and leaving early, but part of me still clung to the idea that I was imagining things. Stress, isolation, maybe a bad dream. I stayed, but I started locking the door with the heavy bolt and keeping a hatchet inside by the cot. The following evening, just after sunset, I heard footsteps. Not animals. Slow, deliberate steps on gravel. I killed the lantern and waited. The steps circled the cabin, slow and steady. Then silence. I didn't sleep. My ears were tuned to every sound. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like a match being struck, then a flicker of orange light through the shutters. I cracked them open slightly and looked out. A small fire burned about 20 feet from the cabin. Just a small pile of sticks. No one was near it, but someone had clearly started it. It wasn't there earlier, and it wasn't for warmth. It was for attention. I didn't go outside. I waited. The fire burned low and died by itself. In the morning, I stepped out and found what looked like ash and broken twigs in a small circle. Same spot I had seen through the shutter. I checked the perimeter, nothing else, but I did notice something new. The locked shed behind the cabin. The old padlock on it had been snapped off. I hadn't even opened it since I arrived. I pulled the door open. Inside were tools, a rusted shovel, a few saws, and some traps. But what made my stomach drop was the empty space in the dust near the back wall. Something heavy had been moved recently, dragged. There was a faint trail in the dust leading out the door and around the back of the cabin, toward the woods. I followed it about 30 feet before it disappeared in the undergrowth. I didn't want to know what had been taken. That afternoon, I packed everything I could and left. I didn't care that I had 5 days left on the rental. I threw my bag in the car and started driving. The road was rough and I drove fast, hitting rocks and skidding in places. About 2 miles from the highway, I saw something ahead in the road. I slowed down. It was the skull of a deer, propped up on a branch in the middle of the trail. And under it, carved into the dirt, was a single word. Stay. I drove around it and didn't stop until I reached Dillon. I got a motel, took a long shower, and tried to convince myself none of it had been real, that I'd imagined it, that some local kids were messing around, that it was all just a string of strange but harmless events. But I knew better. I never went back to Montana. I never found out who was out there, whether it was some recluse, a hunter gone wrong, a trapper who lost his mind, or something else entirely. I don't care. All I know is that someone knew I was at that cabin. They watched me, came close enough to touch the walls, close enough to move things. They didn't want me there. And after that week, I didn't want to be there either. I still get chills when I think about that last night. The silence, the fire, the footsteps, and the fact that no matter how far that cabin was from everything else, someone was already there, and they weren't planning on leaving. I was 35 when I finally got some real time off work. I'd been managing logistics for a trucking company out in Boise for a decade, and it was starting to burn me out. Long hours, never-ending paperwork, and a phone that wouldn't stop ringing. I needed to breathe. My Uncle Pete had passed down a remote hunting cabin up north, close to the Montana border, nestled deep in Clearwater National Forest. I hadn't been up there in years, not since I was a teenager, but I remembered it well. Small, one-story log structure with a tin roof, an old propane heater, and a manual pump for water. No electricity.
No reception.
It was perfect. It was late September, just before the weather got too ugly. I loaded up my truck with my gear, .308 bolt-action rifle, a couple boxes of ammo, camo clothes, sleeping bag, freeze-dried meals, water purifier, hand tools, a first aid kit, headlamp, batteries, a hatchet, and a reliable .45 and a chest rig. I was going solo. I didn't want to answer to anyone. I just wanted to hike, sit in silence, and maybe bag a whitetail if I got lucky. The drive took about 8 hours. I left early in the morning and reached the old logging road around 2 p.m. The trail to the cabin wasn't marked on any GPS. It veered off the gravel road about 2 miles in, winding through thick trees and uneven terrain. I remembered it by landmarks: an old rusted truck cab swallowed by moss, a large stump with a rusted axe blade embedded in it, and a split rock formation like a V. Took me a few tries, but I found the path. The trail was narrow and washed out in some spots. I had to stop and cut a fallen branch at one point, but eventually I made it. The cabin stood just as I remembered it. Weathered wood, some of it grayed and cracked from age. The door was slightly warped but still locked with the same rusted padlock my uncle had put on it years ago. I used the old key he left in the family safe. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and dust, but the place was still intact. Wood stove in the corner, a cot against the wall, shelves with a few canned goods long past expiration, and a small table made of 2x4s and plywood. I aired the place out, set up my sleeping bag, and did a quick walk around the area before sundown. The trees were dense, but I found a few decent vantage points and marked them mentally for tomorrow's hunt. I didn't plan on going too far, maybe a few miles out, just enough to spot some fresh sign. That night was calm. I boiled water over the stove, ate one of the dehydrated meals, and sat outside in the dark, listening to the forest. Coyotes howled far off. I heard the usual rustles of critters in the underbrush. It reminded me why I loved this kind of solitude. The next morning, I was up before dawn. I had a thermos of black coffee and a protein bar, then threw on my gear. I hiked about a mile east where I'd seen some deer scat the evening before. I found a good spot on a ridge overlooking a narrow clearing and waited. A few hours passed. Birds chirped, wind rustled the leaves, but nothing big came by. Around 10:30 a.m., I heard something large breaking branches deeper in the forest, down toward the slope. I stayed still and waited. It wasn't a deer. The pattern was wrong. No stop-start movements or careful steps. Whatever it was, it moved fast, crashing through foliage like it didn't care. I figured it might be a bear. I stood up slowly and backed out, careful not to make noise. I didn't want to mess with a bear while alone. As I made my way back, I noticed something odd. About 20 yards off trail, there was a narrow path I didn't remember being there. Not a game trail. This was cut intentionally. Branches broken clean, some bark shaved off at chest height, and the ground cleared in a thin line, like someone had walked the same spot repeatedly. I walked down it a little curious. It led to a small depression in the land, a low flat spot between ridges. In the middle was what looked like a dugout hole, maybe 6 feet across. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't that old either. The dirt was dark, and there were markings all around it.
Footprints.
Human, not mine. I crouched near it and noticed something else. A thin rope tied to a tree branch and leading down into the hole. Like someone had lowered something or someone down there. I didn't like it. I stepped back. That kind of thing doesn't belong way out here. I turned around and left fast, keeping my rifle in hand. I went straight back to the cabin and stayed close the rest of the day. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything either. I chalked it up to some survivalist type, maybe storing supplies or doing something off-grid. Still, I kept my .45 loaded and slept light that night. Next morning, I changed directions and hiked west instead. Less movement out there. I tracked some hoof prints near a dry stream bed but never got a clear shot. I set up in a tree blind for a while and spotted a lone doe right at dusk, but I let her go. Still, I was more relaxed out there. I didn't think about the hole. That changed on the way back. It was almost dark. I had my headlamp on, following my trail markers back to the cabin. I was about half a mile out when I saw something hanging from a branch. A piece of cloth. Looked like a strip of an old flannel shirt. Not mine. I got closer. It had something drawn on it in black marker. 3 straight lines with a 4th line cutting through diagonally. Like someone marking days. It was fresh. No dirt, no rain damage. Hung about head height. I scanned the woods with my light. My chest got tight. I walked faster. Back at the cabin, I did a full sweep around the perimeter. I even checked the outhouse. Nothing. No tracks. No broken branches. But something felt off. I didn't eat that night. I just sat at the window with the .308 resting across my lap, staring out into the trees. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint metallic clink, like metal against wood. I froze, came again closer. I stepped to the door and pressed my ear to it. Nothing. Then snap. A branch breaking maybe 20 yards out. I flicked off my lantern and crouched. My heart thudded like a drum. I stayed like that for an hour, waiting. When morning came, I didn't wait. I packed everything into the truck, even the trash. I was ready to leave. As I walked out to load the last bag, I noticed something. There were boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. They circled the cabin. Not close, maybe 15 feet out, but they went all the way around. Careful, measured, watching. That was enough for me. I got in and drove. The trail out felt longer than before. Every time I had to slow down for rocks or limbs, I looked over my shoulder. When I finally hit the main road, I didn't stop. I drove straight to the nearest gas station and called the county sheriff. I told them everything. The rope, the hole, the cloth marker, the boot prints. I gave coordinates as close as I could remember. They sent someone a few days later. An officer called me back. They found the hole. Empty. They didn't find any rope. The marker cloth was gone. No recent activity, they said. No sign of squatters or camps. Just woods. But I know what I saw. Someone was out there. Someone who didn't want to be found. Someone who watched me. I haven't been back since. I sold the cabin the next year. Now, when I go hunting, I stay near other people. Motels, campgrounds, places with lights. Out there, in those woods, someone's still walking in circles, still marking days, still watching. It was early October of 2016 when I took a break from work and drove up north to stay in a remote part of Northumberland, England. I was 32 at the time, burned out from city life, tired of emails, meetings, and the sound of traffic. I'd always liked the countryside, and when a coworker mentioned a cabin they once stayed at near the Cheviot Hills, something clicked. It was secluded, had no neighbors for miles, and sat at the edge of a forest just off a small dirt road. I booked it online, packed my gear, and left London early one Thursday morning. The drive took about 7 hours. By the time I arrived, the sun was just starting to sink below the trees. The air felt colder up there, sharper and cleaner. The cabin was small, old, and built from stone and timber. It had a tin roof that looked like it would rattle in the wind. No electricity, just a wood-burning stove, a battery-powered lantern, and an outhouse a few yards behind the cabin. I loved it. I unpacked my gear slowly, taking my time to get used to the silence. No one around, no signal, just the sound of birds, wind in the trees, and the creak of the wooden steps under my boots. That night, I lit a small fire in the stove, warmed up a can of soup, and read a book by lantern light. I hadn't felt that peaceful in years. I didn't hear or see anything strange. Not then. The next morning, I got up early. There was frost on the grass outside. I boiled water on the stove for coffee, wrapped myself in a thick jumper, and stepped out onto the porch to drink it. The forest looked endless from there. Pines and oaks mostly, tall, dark trees that stretched back into the hills. There was a path that led into the woods. I decided to follow it later that day. After breakfast, I packed a small rucksack with water, a sandwich, and a compass. I followed the narrow trail into the trees, moving slowly, listening. Everything smelled damp and earthy. I walked for about 2 hours, climbing gently uphill, until I found a clearing with a view of the valley. I sat there for a while, eating my sandwich, breathing deeply. It was quiet, too quiet maybe, but I didn't think much of it. Not then. On the way back, I took a different path that looped around the east side of the woods. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the trees, a shadow, or maybe a tall stump. But as I got closer, I could see that it was a woman. She stood just off the path, maybe 15 feet into the woods, facing sideways, not moving. Her clothes looked worn. Long skirt, heavy coat, boots covered in mud. Her hair was gray or maybe white, tied back in a messy bun. I slowed down but didn't stop. She didn't look at me, just stood there, completely still, like a statue. I walked past, trying not to stare. I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to make eye contact. Something about her felt wrong, not in a supernatural way, just off. I've passed people on hiking trails before, in the peaks and the lakes, and they usually smile or nod. She didn't do either. She just stood there, like she was waiting for something, watching something, but not me. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door, even though it felt silly. I made dinner, tried to read, but kept thinking about that woman. Who was she? There were no other cabins nearby. I hadn't passed any parked cars on the trail.
No tents.
Nothing. The forest wasn't tourist heavy. Most walkers used the main trails, not the overgrown ones near where I saw her. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside. Once, just after midnight, I sat up in bed because I was sure I heard the crunch of boots on gravel. But when I peered out the window, I saw nothing. Only trees and darkness. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined it all. Maybe she was just an old local out for a walk. Maybe she lived off the grid. Northumberland has its fair share of loners. Still, I decided not to go far that day. I stayed close to the cabin, gathered some firewood, and cleaned out the stove. It rained off and on, so I stayed inside most of the afternoon. Around 5 p.m., I stepped out to stretch my legs. That's when I saw the footprint. It was on the side of the cabin, near the back, just under the window. The ground was still damp from the rain, and there in the mud was a deep boot print. It wasn't mine. The tread was different, smaller but wide, like an old walking boot. There were no other tracks leading away, just one clean print, as if someone had stood there for a long time, then backed away into the grass where no tracks showed. I walked around the cabin slowly, scanning the trees. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything, but my stomach was tight, my mouth dry. I went back inside, locked the door again, and pulled the curtain across the window. That night, I slept with the hatchet I'd brought for chopping wood next to my sleeping bag. On Sunday, I packed early. I was supposed to stay until Tuesday, but I'd had enough. I planned to hike out to the car by noon and drive back south. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, mostly because I couldn't explain it without sounding paranoid. I made one last trip out to the outhouse before leaving. The path ran about 15 meters through some overgrowth. As I stepped inside the wooden shack and closed the door, I noticed something strange. There was something hanging on the inside of the outhouse door, a bit of red fabric tied to a rusty nail, like a strip from an old coat or skirt. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of that. I used the outhouse yesterday and the day before, and that rag was new. I didn't touch it. I finished quickly and walked straight back to the cabin. As I turned the key in the lock, I heard something. Not a voice, but the sound of branches snapping. Close. I turned and scanned the trees. Nothing. But then, from the corner of my eye, I caught movement. She was there again. The same woman, standing at the edge of the trees, maybe 20 yards away. Still, watching. Same clothes, same posture. She didn't move, didn't react. I felt my hands shaking as I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. I waited there, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the front window. I didn't see her leave. When I finally built up the courage to peek outside again, she was gone. I didn't waste any more time. I threw everything into my backpack, grabbed the rest of my gear, and left. I didn't even sweep up or check if I'd forgotten anything. I just walked fast, eyes darting into the trees every few seconds. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, I sat there for a long time, staring at the woods. The drive home felt longer. I stopped twice just to get my breathing under control. That night, back in my flat in Islington, I didn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. I kept thinking I'd see her again. Not in the woods, but here, outside my window or at the foot of the stairs. For a while, I didn't tell anyone, but I did some digging online. I searched for missing persons, strange sightings, anything that might explain who she was. I found nothing. No reports, no photos, just silence. But I kept thinking about the footprint, the way she stood there watching, and that strip of fabric in the outhouse. A few months later, I received an email from the property owner. He thanked me for staying, asked if I had any feedback. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. I asked him if anyone else had stayed recently. He said no, in fact, I was the first visitor in over 9 months. He said the path was too washed out most of the year and that most people canceled. He also mentioned something odd, that the last guest before me had left early too.
No explanation.
Just gone. I deleted the email and didn't reply. Years have passed since then, and I haven't been back to Northumberland. I haven't gone camping since either. I still think about that woman sometimes. The way she didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there like she belonged to the trees. Was she dangerous? I don't know. She never came close. She never tried to get in. But she was always there, near, silent, watching. And sometimes, when I walk home late or take out the bins at night, I feel that same sensation again. That prickle on the back of my neck. That heavy, silent pressure. Like someone standing just beyond the reach of the streetlight. Watching, not moving, just there. And I wonder if she ever left those woods. Or if maybe I brought something back with me. But I don't go near the forest anymore. And I don't open the curtains after dark. Not anymore. It was September of 2016, and I had just turned 33. I needed a break from the city. The noise, the people, the long work hours, it had all become too much. My name's Darren Fields, and back then, I was living in a cramped apartment in Baltimore, Maryland. I worked construction and had barely taken any time off in years. I had saved up some vacation days, so I decided to rent a small cabin out in the rural hills of Western Virginia, near the West Virginia state line. I didn't want a tourist spot or anything commercial. I wanted something private, isolated, quiet. I found a listing online from a man who inherited an old family cabin outside of a town called Buffalo Gap. It wasn't listed on any of the big rental sites. Just a photo, a short description, and an email address. It was cheap, and it looked exactly like what I needed. A single-story wooden structure tucked deep in the woods, surrounded by overgrown grass and forest. No neighbors for miles. A gravel road connected it to a county route, and there was no cell signal unless you climbed a hill about a mile away. It had running water from a well and electricity powered by a small solar rig. No internet. That's what sold me. I packed up my dog, a 5-year-old black lab named Jax, and drove 5.5 hours west. The further we got from the city, the more the landscape changed. Gas stations became fewer, trees thicker. The last leg of the trip took us down a twisting, cracked road barely wide enough for 2 cars. After passing an empty field and a rusted barbed wire fence, I found the gravel turnoff. It took another 15 minutes to reach the cabin from there, winding through thick woods and dipping into small valleys. The road had ruts and muddy patches, but my old truck made it fine. When the cabin finally came into view, it felt like entering a forgotten place. It sat crooked near the edge of a sloping clearing. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the porch boards were gray with age. But the door worked, and the windows weren't broken. That was enough for me. Inside was basic but fine. A cot-style bed, a wood-burning stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a shelf stocked with canned food, matches, and old paperbacks. The walls smelled of cedar and damp wood. The bathroom was just a toilet and a tiny shower, but the water pressure worked, and the lights came on when I flipped the switch. No complaints. The first night was peaceful. Jax curled up by the stove, and I sat out on the porch with a flashlight, listening to the chirps and howls from the dark forest. Crickets, owls, distant coyotes. The air was cold and clean. I slept better than I had in months. The second day, I explored the land. There wasn't a marked trail, but deer paths ran through the brush, and I followed one that looped around the back of the cabin. I found an old rusted water pump sticking out of the ground, half covered in moss. Further back, I came across what looked like the remains of an even older building. Just a stone foundation with rotting timbers collapsed inward. Maybe a barn. Jack sniffed around but didn't act nervous. I kept exploring. That afternoon, about a mile from the cabin, I stumbled onto a clearing with something I hadn't expected. A trail camera strapped to a tree. It was old and weathered, barely hanging on by the frayed strap. It hadn't been triggered in a while, the lens was fogged, and the battery case was corroded. I didn't think much of it, but it did make me wonder who had put it there. Maybe a hunter, maybe the guy who owned the cabin. I left it alone. That night, I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to the sound of Jack's growling. Not barking, just a low, constant growl. I sat up in bed. It was pitch dark except for a sliver of moonlight coming through the window. I listened, heart pounding. Jax was facing the front door, still growling low in his throat. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly got up. I didn't hear anything outside. No footsteps, no voices, no animals moving. But Jax wouldn't stop. His ears were up, and he was tense. I cracked the front door open and shined the flashlight out into the yard. Nothing. Just the clearing, the trees, and the gravel drive curving off into the woods. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning slowly, then walked a few feet into the grass. Still nothing. Then I noticed something strange. About 20 feet from the porch, there was a patch of crushed grass and flattened weeds. It wasn't there the day before. It looked like someone had stood there for a long time or walked back and forth. No footprints exactly, just a vague impression. I couldn't be sure in the dark, but it made my skin crawl. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat up for an hour with a hunting knife on the table next to me. Eventually, I dozed off and the sun came up. The next morning, I took Jax back out to the spot. In the daylight, it was easier to see the matted grass. It definitely looked like something had been standing there. A few broken twigs nearby. Still no boot prints or shoe treads. Just pressure marks in the soil, like something heavy had been pacing or shifting weight. I started to feel uneasy, but I didn't want to panic. Could have been a bear, or a deer, or just my imagination. I had a .22 rifle in the truck, so I brought it inside and leaned it against the wall. Better safe than sorry. That day, I didn't go far from the cabin. I chopped some wood, cleaned up a bit, tried to stay busy. Every so often, I'd catch Jax staring into the woods with his ears up. Not barking, just watching, like he sensed something. On the 4th day, things got worse. I went for a walk late in the afternoon, sticking to the same deer trail behind the cabin. About a half-mile in, I found a spot where bark had been stripped off a tree. Clean strips, almost like with a blade, not claw marks. And near the base of the trunk was a piece of duct tape stuck to a rock. Just a small strip, maybe 3 inches long. It didn't belong there. I looked around and found another piece, about 10 feet away, stuck to a branch. Then another one down the slope, pinned under a flat stone. Felt like a trail, like someone had marked this area. That night, I blocked the cabin door with a chair and kept the rifle by the bed. Jax was restless, pacing and sniffing the walls. Every now and then, he would growl again. I kept the porch light on. I barely slept. At dawn, I went out and checked the clearing again. This time, there were boot prints. Not mine. Not fresh either, maybe from the night before, but deep enough to be clear. They came in from the woods, stopped 20 feet from the porch again, and then went back the same way. Whoever it was had stood there and watched. Not just once, but twice now. At least, that was enough for me. I decided to leave the next morning. I had planned to stay a full week, but I wasn't about to wait for someone to come closer. I packed up most of my gear, refilled the water jugs, and loaded the truck. That evening, I took Jax on one last short walk near the cabin, sticking close. When we came back, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the far side of the clearing, almost hidden behind the trees, something shiny caught the light. I walked over slowly. It was a small hunting blind, collapsible, camouflage, set up just inside the tree line. It hadn't been there earlier that week. Inside was a stool, some water bottles, and an empty snack wrapper. Someone had been watching the cabin. Watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I left before sunrise, drove fast, and didn't stop until I hit the first gas station on the main road. I told the man who rented me the cabin what I found. He seemed surprised but not concerned. Said it was probably some local hunter trespassing. Maybe, but it felt like more than that. A few weeks later, I read online that someone else had rented the cabin and reported a break-in. No one was hurt, but their car tires were slashed. Police never found who did it. Just an open door, missing food, and knife marks on the porch. I haven't gone back to that part of Virginia since.